Hey there, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast and jbshreve.com, where we help believers make sense of the chaotic world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made those times. And in today's episode, we're continuing our deep dive into American history and this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. Today, we're going to be looking at the turning point of the American Civil War and the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, as you know, my focus on this story is not so much about the military history and things like that. You can find that out there. My focus, though, is on the ideas, the perceptions of America. And Gettysburg is really significant because in the grand story of American history, this is the moment of reboot for the nation. The ideas of right and wrong, morality, truth, they get redefined at Gettysburg. The places where the nation had kind of strayed, the places they'd strayed from since the Declaration of Independence, those values that became more about ideas and less about reality since the Declaration of Independence, well, they get confronted here at Gettysburg. And America's leaders decided this would be a place where the nation would change, where the nation would reboot. I find this story really fascinating. Remember, you can find all sorts of supporting articles, blog posts, things like that to go along with this episode and other episodes in this series by heading over to the website at theendofhistory.net. If you're interested in a deep dive into American history from a faith-based perspective, that's a great place to start.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So, as a history nerd, I'm waiting on all of this AI, all this virtual technology stuff to be able to create for us a virtual time machine. I genuinely, honestly see this as a possibility in the near future. I hope it is anyway. I should be able to put on a pair of goggles or whatever device is necessary and step back in time to see some great event of history as though it were happening right in front of me. Not a movie, not a documentary. I want to step into the virtual world and feel like I'm in the middle of the actual experience from history. Now, the American Civil War, with its convergence with photography and the billions of words that have been written about it, it seems to me like something that's there at the forefront for AI to utilize and be able to bring this idea of a virtual time machine into reality. We have the data. We just have to create the interface, right? And if this ever happens, the number one thing I would like to look back into, especially in the recent historical past, the thing I want to look back and see is the famous event of the American Civil War at the Battle of Gettysburg, and it's this event called Pickett's Charge. This is the place where the fate of the Civil War, the fate of America, where it changed directions. It's the place, the moment where ideas like the lost cause were born. This is the pivot point of all the drama and the violence of the American Civil War. That's where we're going today, as we look at the Battle of Gettysburg, and I want to explain why this moment is so significant. Now, you can get an overview of the battle plans, like I've said. You can look at the tactics of what happened at Gettysburg. There's a lot of good podcasts out there if you want to look at that. Heck, if you ever get a chance to visit Gettysburg, take that chance, all right? You need to see what happened there. You want to understand it. But what I want to do in this episode specifically, in this whole section of episodes, is not a deep dive on military strategy of the war, but on what was happening in the broader view. Then we'll zoom in this episode, as we look at that broader view. We're going to zoom in from there on Pickett's Charge when we get to that point of the story. Gettysburg was the largest battle ever fought on American soil. It was also the moment when the American Civil War really pivoted. Before Gettysburg, the Confederacy, they still possessed a plausible path to independence. After Gettysburg, that path narrowed almost to a thread before it finally disappeared. The battle shattered armies. It transformed hopes into despair, and it coincided with a triumph hundreds of miles away that would permanently alter the course of the war. In many ways, the story of Gettysburg is the story of a nation standing at a crossroads, uncertain whether it would survive at all. And at this battle, we get to follow the story of where our nation went, and we can also look back and see what we left behind at the crossroads. To understand the significance of Gettysburg, we probably need to look westward first. And we need to look at another major event unfolding at the same time of the Civil War. In the spring of 1863, while all the attention in the East focused on the elegant and seemingly invincible army and leadership of General Robert E. Lee, another general was quietly changing the war in the West, Ulysses S. Grant. He's operating along the Mississippi River. Now, unlike many Union commanders in the East, Grant was just relentless. He didn't obsess over what the enemy might do. He concentrated on what he himself would do. By this point, many of the Union generals, they're kind of fixated on Robert E. Lee. His legend was already in the making, and they were constantly terrified that he would do some unexpected things and take them by surprise, show them up, and just humiliate them. There's this famous quote by Grant. Now, this was later in the war when he got fed up with all of the focus on Robert E. Lee among his own generals and staff. And he said, "Oh, I'm heartily tired of hearing about what Lee is going to do. Some of you always seem to think he is suddenly going to turn a double somersault and land in our rear and on both of our flanks at the same time. Go back to your command and try to think what we are going to do ourselves instead of what Lee is going to do." That's what Grant was all about. He wasn't afraid of Lee. In fact, he would be the one to finally defeat the great Southern general in the future. But before all that happened, before Grant was given full command of the Union forces, he really seemed a pretty unlikely candidate for greatness of any sort. He was born in 1822. Ulysses S. Grant, he attended the United States Military Academy, where he was an average student who excelled in horsemanship but showed little sign of any future military brilliance. His name was actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. His initials came to, if you look at that, it comes to a hug, H-U-G, and that was what was written on his saddle, or what was going to be written on his saddle. So he changed the order of his name when he went to military school, Ulysses Hiram Grant. There was an error on his admission paperwork to the military school, and they got his name as Ulysses S. Grant. It was wrong, but he didn't fight it. He's not a guy who's going to quibble over that kind of thing. Years later, people would say his initials, U.S. Grant, stood for Unconditional Surrender Grant. That's later, and again, it's really a twist or a little quirk of paperwork that caused all of that legend to come about. After military school, Grant served with distinction during the Mexican-American War under the command of Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott. He learned valuable lessons about leadership, about logistics. After that war, however, Grant's life really began to unravel. He was isolated at distant frontier posts. He was separated from his wife and children. He struggled with loneliness. He eventually even resigned from the Army in 1854. For the next several years, life's pretty difficult for Ulysses S. Grant. He failed as a farmer. He worked in real estate, and he eventually found employment in his father's leather goods store in Galena. Now, he hated working in this store. He hated being around that kind of stuff. There's another story about Grant from this particular time period, and it tells about him hauling a wagon full of firewood into town to sell on the streets there in the local community. Now, he's literally just trying to make a living for his family. Huge contrast to the aristocracy of Robert E. Lee and his fame during this same time period, because Lee is pretty famous already by this point in the American story and among the American military. Well, as Grant is hauling the wood, this wagon load of firewood, into town, a soldier that he once served with passes him on the road. And upon recognizing Grant, the soldier's, he's just kind of in shock. And he says, "Grant, is that you?" Grant nods and he just keeps on moving. He nods his head, keeps on moving. And the soldier can't figure out why this famous officer, or at least effective officer, from the Mexican War is hauling firewood now. It seems so beneath him. So he asks, he says, "What is it you're doing?" Well, Grant looks up in the manner that he becomes famous for, and he calmly and simply replies, "Trying to solve the problem of poverty." Now, I love that story for what it captures about Ulysses S. Grant, and also how it shows such a contrast to the more famous general he would end up fighting with and defeating in the future, that of course being Robert E. Lee. By 1860, few would have predicted that this guy, Ulysses S. Grant would become the Union's foremost military leader. He also developed a reputation for having a major problem with alcohol. That's another side story, backstory there to Ulysses S. Grant. Growing up in the South, this was always my picture of Grant. He was the drunk leader of the Union Army. His friends helped keep most of those rumors about his drunkenness and struggle with alcohol at least under control, if not at bay. But the reputation really did follow him most of his life. The outbreak of the American Civil War really changed everything. Grant volunteered his services, and he quickly demonstrated a rare quality among Union commanders. And that rare quality, aggressiveness. While many generals like George McClellan, they hesitated, Grant moved. In 1862, he captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. He earned national fame when he demanded the enemy's unconditional surrender. That's where the nickname comes from, U.S. Grant, unconditional surrender. Later that year, after the bloody Battle of Shiloh that we talked about in an earlier episode, it's Grant who endures criticism, but he would ultimately emerge determined, still, and unshaken. He was moved to the Western theater of the war, of the fighting, but unliked by a lot of the political leadership of the Union Army. And remember, that was one of the problems, all of the political leaders within that Union Army. By 1863, Grant focused on the Confederate forces and their fortress city of Vicksburg. Now, controlling Vicksburg meant controlling the Mississippi River, the Confederacy's vital lifeline. After months of failed attempts, Ulysses S. Grant, he boldly marched his army south, crossed the river, and cut loose from traditional supply lines. Very, very risky move for military leaders. Through a series of rapid victories, he trapped the Confederate army inside Vicksburg, inside the city. And so he basically laid siege to the city. And as the siege tightened, Grant stood on the verge of one of the most decisive victories in American military history, a triumph that would elevate him from successful general to the Union's now indispensable commander. For months, Grant maneuvered against the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. The city, it sits atop bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. As long as Vicksburg remained in Southern hands, the Confederacy retained control of a crucial artery linking Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana to the Eastern Confederacy. So Grant's campaign, it's really audacious. He marched his army through swamps, crossed the Mississippi, south of the Mississippi River, south of the city. He cut loose from many of his supply lines. He plunged deep into enemy territory. Again and again, he defeated Confederate forces sent against him on their own territory, on their own turf. And by June 1863, like I said, he had trapped Vicksburg. He had laid siege to it. Well, life inside the city, inside Vicksburg during Grant's siege, really a daily struggle for survival. Beginning in May 1863, Union forces surrounded the city and they subjected it to nearly constant artillery bombardment. Shells rained down day and night, crashing through homes, businesses, churches. Residents quickly learned that nowhere above ground was safe for them to go. To escape the relentless shelling, many families dug caves into the soft clay hillsides surrounding the city. These crude shelters became makeshift homes for thousands of civilians. Entire families lived underground for weeks, sleeping on blankets spread across dirt floors and emerging only when they had to, only when it was necessary. Children played in the caves while adults listened anxiously to the thunder of exploding artillery overhead. Now, food soon became the city's residents their greatest concern. As Yankee troops tightened their grip around the city, supplies within dwindled rapidly. Fresh vegetables just disappeared. Meat became scarce. Eventually, residents resorted to eating mules, dogs, even rats. It was like a typical historical siege type atmosphere. One civilian wrote that hunger became a constant companion, weakening the body and spirit. Disease spread easily in the crowded conditions, while the summer heat, just if you've ever been in the South in the summer, the summer heat just added to all that misery. But despite hardship, the people in Vicksburg, many civilians and soldiers, they clung stubbornly to hope. They believed Confederate relief forces would eventually arrive and break this siege. But the rescue wasn't coming. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, he encouraged Robert E. Lee to move west and remove Grant from Vicksburg. But Lee had a plan he considered not only more daring, but if successful, it could change the whole game of the war. Now remember Lee's primary motive for fighting in the war. It was to defend his own homeland, okay? So he's less interested in Mississippi, or one could argue this at least. He's less interested in Vicksburg and Mississippi and the western front of the fighting than he is in the eastern front and the places around Virginia and Richmond. Well, the Confederate victory at Chancellorsville in May 1863, it had been dazzling, and Lee had defeated a much larger Union army through his daring maneuvers, through his audacity that he's famous for. Gone were the days when the Confederate press and critics once referred to him as Granny Lee for being too cautious, but the victory there came at a terrible price. His most trusted lieutenant, as we've seen, Stonewall Jackson, had been mortally wounded by friendly fire. And Lee understood something many Southerners preferred not to acknowledge. The Confederacy was slowly bleeding to death. The South had fewer men, fewer factories, fewer railroads, and fewer resources than the North did. So time actually favored the Union, actually favored the North. If the Confederacy was to survive, Lee believed it needed something dramatic. An invasion of the North offered several possibilities if he could accomplish this. It might relieve pressure on war-torn Virginia. It might allow Confederate soldiers to forage from northern farms. And most importantly, it might produce a decisive victory on Union soil that could weaken Northern morale and encourage this growing anti-war sentiment in the North. Perhaps it could even influence foreign governments to pressure Washington into negotiations. So that invasion of the North was really the background to the Battle of Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee was taking the battle to the doorsteps of the Union. In June 1863, Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia north towards the Shenandoah Valley and into Pennsylvania, and the invasion electrified the Confederacy. Many Southern soldiers believed they were finally carrying the war to their enemy. After 2 years of seeing their own farms ravaged, their own towns occupied, they marched through rich northern countryside with a sense of confidence bordering on destiny. One Confederate recalled that the feeling that they were entering the enemy's country at last. And so as Lee's moved north, the Union Army of the Potomac raced to intercept him. The Army had recently received a new commander, George G. Meade. Meade had held command only a few days when he suddenly found himself responsible for defending the entire North against this invasion from Robert E. Lee. Neither commander intended Gettysburg to become the site of a great battle. The town simply sat at the convergence of several crossroads, kind of like, spokes on a wheel. Highways radiated outward in every direction. So as Confederate and Yankee units searched for one another, those roads drew them towards the same place almost by accident, and that same place was Gettysburg. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, Confederate soldiers approached Gettysburg from the west. In fact, the first fighting did begin almost accidentally. Confederate troops encountered Union cavalry under General John Buford. Buford immediately recognized the importance of the ridges south of town. If Union forces could hold long enough to occupy that high ground, they would possess a powerful defensive position. So his cavalrymen, they delayed the Confederate advance. The fighting that morning was fierce. It was personal. Men fired from behind fences, barns, stone walls. Officers galloped through clouds of smoke, trying desperately to understand what was taking place, what was happening, to get to orient themselves. As Union infantry arrived, the battle escalated. Throughout July 1st, Confederate attacks drove Federal troops back through Gettysburg itself. Streets filled with terrified civilians. Bullets shattered windows. Families hid in basements. Churches became hospitals. You see all these stories. If you go to Gettysburg and the museums there, I went as a child and I still remember the stories today. When you see the actual landscapes and walk through the I guess it's a national park that you see there, you can learn all these stories. Union soldiers eventually retreated south to town to Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. There they found something priceless, and that priceless thing they found, high ground. By evening, the Union Army occupied a fishhook-shaped defensive line stretching across the hills and ridges south of Gettysburg. Confederate forces held the surrounding approaches. Now the stage was set. That night, thousands of men lay awake. Many wrote letters home. Others, they prayed. Some stared silently into the darkness, wondering what was coming. One soldier wrote in his journal he remembered hearing wounded men crying out between the lines. And those sounds haunted everyone. No one had any idea that far, far worse was about to happen. Far, far worse was coming. By the way, pay attention to the dates here. This is July 1st, 1863. We're nearing the nation's birthday, Independence Day. America's birthday seems to have this uncanny knack for major events taking place. Hey folks, JB Shreve here. I hope you're enjoying this podcast episode as well as the wider series. If you're into learning, if you're into faith-based perspectives of history and of current events, I want to invite you to become an Into History Insider at our Patreon page. You can find the links to the Patreon group at theendofhistory.net or by going directly to patreon.com/JB Shreve. A Patreon supporter, for as little as $1 a month, you can access some of our past series all the way from the history of the Middle East, the history of India, how the world works in the School of International Relations, and many, many more podcast series, all of these that have been produced and published since the End of History began in 2012. That's patreon.com/JB Shreve. When you join, be sure to watch your inbox for an email from me where you'll find a link to join our End of History WhatsApp group that includes relevant discussions about today's current events. Again, head to patreon.com/JB Shreve and sign up as a Patreon supporter to the End of History today. So July 2nd, 1863 in Gettysburg. The day opened with heat and with tension. Robert E. Lee examined the Union position and he decides we're going to attack. His army launches this massive assault against both Union flanks. On the Union left stood places that would become legendary. Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard. These are famous names in the battle, or famous assignments and locations in the Battle of Gettysburg. These names, they sound almost peaceful today. On that afternoon, they became slaughterhouses. At Little Round Top, Union soldiers scrambled among rocks and trees while Confederate troops surged uphill. Men fought at astonishingly close ranges. Ammunition ran low. Units became tangled together. One famous moment came when the Colonel, Joshua Chamberlain, ordered a bayonet charge after his regiment exhausted its ammunition. That charge swept down the hill and helped save the Union flank. Elsewhere, the wheat field changed hands repeatedly. A soldier later described the field as being covered so thickly with bodies that one could walk across portions of it without touching the ground. At Devil's Den, there at Gettysburg, sharpshooters hid among gigantic boulders while artillery blasted the landscape apart. The fighting stretched late into the evening. Again and again, Confederate troops attacked, and again, Union troops, they bent, their lines bent, but they wouldn't break. And when darkness finally arrived, thousands were dead. Thousands more were wounded. But the Union line, it still stood. It still held. Reviewing the carnage, General Robert E. Lee, he remained convinced victory was still possible. Many of his officers, however, they were less certain. The Confederate assaults had been really costly. The Union position appeared stronger than ever, but none were willing to challenge or question the great General Lee. Robert E. Lee believed one more powerful blow might shatter the Federal center, the Yankee Union center. That belief led him to one of the most famous and tragic assaults in military history. The morning of July 3rd, it dawned once again hot and humid, and across open fields south of Gettysburg, Confederate soldiers prepared for what would become their most famous attack. The assault, it would involve roughly 12,500 men, and among them was the division of General George Pickett, whose Virginians had arrived late and missed much of the earlier fighting. George Pickett was one of the most, I guess you'd say, colorful, one of the most recognizable officers in the Confederate Army. But by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, he really possessed surprisingly little experience commanding troops in major combat. He was a graduate of the United States Military Academy. Pickett had served with distinction like so many other generals during the Mexican-American War. He earned a reputation for personal bravery, personal charm during that fighting. His flowing hair, his immaculate uniform, his dramatic personality, it really made him a favorite among both soldiers and fellow officers. Well, despite his reputation, Pickett had spent much of the Civil War away from the Army's most important battles. He missed the major campaigns that established the fame of Confederate commanders like James Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson, and others. So assigned to duties in Virginia and North Carolina, Pickett had little opportunity to gain experience directing large formations under intense battlefield conditions. In fact, he had not yet taken his men into full combat by this point. So as a result, when he arrived at Gettysburg in July 1863, Pickett was well known. He was personally courageous and widely liked, but largely untested in the kinds of high-stakes command that the coming battle was going to demand. So his name would soon become forever linked to one of the most famous and one of the most disastrous assaults in American military history. As the Confederate soldiers formed ranks, many seemed, they sensed the danger. The Union Army occupied the stronger positions on Cemetery Ridge. So between the armies, there was nearly a mile of open ground, little cover within that mile. And the attack by Pickett and his men, his 12,500 men, it would require thousands of men to march directly into concentrated artillery and rifle fire without cover. Some Confederate officers privately doubted this plan that Lee had put together. But again, they're reluctant to contest the great General Lee. General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted corps commander by this point, he opposed it strongly, all right? He did not think this would work. He believed the attack would fail. He looked out on that open field, and he saw no way around the slaughter that was about to come, was about to happen. And this is why I say if you ever get the chance to visit Gettysburg, again, you ought to do it. When you see that field that had to be charged across by Pickett and his men, you can see the impossibility of it all. A barrage of artillery fire from the Confederates opened the day's fighting. The intent was to weaken the Union front lines in preparation for Pickett's charge. It's violent, chaotic, and in line with all that had gone on since the two armies first arrived at Gettysburg. Then the Union lines returned fire. It went on for a while, and then the battlefield fell silent. The Union officers, they ordered a ceasefire, partially among their men, partially to preserve ammunition, partially to lure the Confederates out into the open, and partially just to see what would happen next. When Lee gave the signal to Longstreet to send Pickett and his soldiers into the fight, Longstreet hesitated for a real long moment. Many of the other Confederate officers feared that what was about to unfold. General Pickett didn't. All right, he was excited. He saw his chance at glory lying right there in front of him. He just had to go grab it. He and his men had to just go grab it. So he approaches Longstreet and he asks if he and his men should now go forward. Is now the time to advance? And Longstreet wouldn't answer. It's like he couldn't bring himself to say, okay, go. He couldn't bring himself to give the command, but he also couldn't bring himself to disagree and contest Robert E. Lee. So Longstreet simply looks down and he just nods his head in answer to Pickett's question. It ranks as one of the most heartbreaking moments of the war, as far as these mass deaths and unnecessary deaths. The Confederate artillery barrage began shortly after 1 p.m. The earth shook, cannons roared continuously, smoke rolled across the field, and many soldiers believed the bombardment was destroying the Union line. In reality, much of this firing overshot its targets. Union artillery was largely survived and was ready to receive Pickett's charge. Around 3 p.m., Pickett's infantry advanced. The sight was kind of magnificent as well as terrible. Long lines of gray-clad soldiers emerged from the woods and stepped out into the open. Flags fluttered, drums beat, officers shouted commands. The formations moved with parade ground precision. Young men from different locales across the South marched out into the open of this field on their way to advance against the Union Army, against the Yankees, and they're determined, this is where I find glory. A lot of the Union soldiers, they just watched in awe. One Union officer later recalled in his journals it's the most magnificent spectacle he had ever witnessed. And then the killing begins. Union artillery opened fire. Shells exploded amid the advancing ranks. Entire sections of the charging Confederate troops disappeared in smoke and blood. Men fell by the hundreds, but the lines continued forward. Survivors instinctively closed gaps only to swallow up new barrages from the Union lines. The Confederate advance never stopped. As they neared Cemetery Ridge, Union infantry unleashed devastating volleys. Rifles tore through the Confederate formations. Still they came. One Confederate soldier recalled feeling as though the air itself had become solid lead. Finally, Portions of the Confederate assault, reached the Union line. Near a clump of trees and a low stone wall, Confederate troops briefly penetrated the Yankee position. This position became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Remember that phrase for a later episode. For a few moments, desperate hand-to-hand fighting erupted. The Union reinforcements counterattacked. The breakthrough collapsed. The Confederate survivors began retreating. The return journey across the fields was even worse. The wounded crawled. Officers searched desperately for remnants of their command. Entire regiments ceased to exist as effective fighting units. Of the roughly 12,500 Confederates who participated in Pickett's charge, over half became casualties. Think about that number. Pickett's division was devastated. When Lee asked Pickett to rally his men, the shattered general reportedly replied, "General Lee, I have no division." The charge failed. The battle was lost. In the decades after the war, Pickett's charge would acquire this mythic significance in Southern memory and Southern lore. This is where many historians trace the emotional origins of what became known as the Lost Cause. Now, we're going to look at the Lost Cause in greater depth in a later episode, but for now, we should note that the Lost Cause wasn't simply an interpretation of military events. It became a cultural narrative through which white Southerners explained their defeat. In that narrative, Confederate soldiers were portrayed as noble, as heroic, and virtually unbeatable except against overwhelming odds. Gettysburg, particularly Pickett's charge, fit perfectly into that framework. The image was irresistible. Brave Southern soldiers marching courageously into impossible fire. Honor overcoming fear. Sacrifice transcending defeat. The charge became less a military event and more a symbol. Many former Confederates in later years preferred to remember the courage displayed during those moments rather than confront the political and economic realities that doomed the Confederacy. And the legend grew. Books, speeches, monuments, reunions transformed Pickett's charge into the centerpiece of Southern remembrance. But stripped of myth, the charge represented something simpler and really just more tragic. It's the moment when Confederate hopes collided with reality. Courage was not going to overcome math. All right. Heroism couldn't replace manpower. Valor couldn't erase industrial imbalance. The Confederacy had reached its utter limit. And so as Lee rode among the retreating soldiers after the charge, he did accept responsibility, at least initially. "It's all my fault," he told many of them. George Pickett, he lived until 1875, 10 years after the war and 5 years after the death of Robert E. Lee, and to his dying day, he never forgave Lee for giving the order that launched Pickett's charge. For now, at least, Lee and the Confederate Army, they remain intact. But it would never again possess the offensive power that it displayed before Gettysburg. The battle ended on July 4th, Independence Day. Lee began retreating toward Virginia. Meade pursued, the General Meade, the leader of the Union Army now. He pursued cautiously. The Army of Northern Virginia escaped total destruction once again. But something fundamental had changed. The aura of Confederacy invincibility, of Robert E. Lee's invincibility, it was now gone. The psychological impact was enormous. Families across the South anxiously awaited casualty lists. Communities discovered that entire groups of young men had just vanished. Churches filled with mourners. Confidence faded. At precisely the same moments, another catastrophe struck the Confederacy. On July 4th, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge, Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. The timing seemed almost providential from a northern perspective. While Lee retreated from Gettysburg, Grant captured one of the Confederacy's most important strongholds. The Mississippi River fell under the Union control, and the Confederacy was now effectively split in two. Texas, Arkansas, and much of Louisiana became isolated from the Eastern Confederacy. The strategic consequences here were immense. The emotional consequences were really even greater. Northerners who had endured years of frustration, now they had received twin victories on July 4th, Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And these were major victories. Lincoln was frustrated that General Meade didn't pursue Lee and the Confederates and finish the job. But Grant, reflecting on that moment years later, he explained that probably wasn't a realistic expectation. Although victorious at Gettysburg, the Union Army was not organized well enough for such a pursuit. Meade had only been in charge for less than a week here. Within days, hope surged across the Union. For Southerners, the opposite occurred. Many recognized the significance immediately. The Confederacy had suffered major defeats in both principal theaters of war simultaneously. After July 1863, Southern suffering deepened. Union armies increasingly seized territory. Blockades tightened. Food shortages worsened. Inflation spiraled. Families throughout the South endured growing deprivation. The war many had expected to end quickly now became a grinding struggle for survival in the South. The Confederacy would continue fighting for nearly 2 more years, but the momentum had shifted permanently here. Gettysburg was not the final battle, but it was the turning point. The road from Gettysburg eventually led to Grant's promotion, the Overland Campaign, and the siege of Petersburg, and ultimately to a Confederate surrender. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, though, of Gettysburg, it emerged just a few months later. In November 1863, Americans gathered to dedicate a national cemetery there on the battlefield at Gettysburg. Thousands of soldiers remained buried there. Many bodies were still being identified. Families continued searching for loved ones. The nation remained exhausted by grief. And the featured speaker that day was the renowned orator, Edward Everett. His speech, that no one remembers, lasted more than 2 hours. And then President Lincoln, also a guest, he rose to speak. His remarks lasted only a few minutes, but they became immortal. Lincoln understood that Americans needed more than military victory. They needed a meaning to all of this. And this is what makes Lincoln one of the greats in world history. The war had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. What purpose justified such sacrifice? And Lincoln answered by redefining the nation itself with these words, the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Rather than describing America as merely a union of states, Lincoln here, in this Gettysburg Address, he spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In just a few sentences, he transforms the moral framework of the war, and perhaps even the nation. I think he did transform the framework of the nation, at least for a time, at least the intent. A lot of historians see the moral foundation of America in the Declaration of Independence with a recommitment to that moral vision at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The conflict was no longer about preserving the Union. It's not just about that anymore. It now became a test of whether democratic self-government could survive. The dead at Gettysburg had not merely defended territory, they had participated in what Lincoln called this new birth of freedom. Their sacrifice became linked to the unfinished promise of equality contained in the nation's founding ideals. And that vision outlived the battle here, and it would outlive the war, thanks to Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. That's it for today's episode. We're going to be back real soon with our next look, another episode on the Civil War, and our podcast series here, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve with The End of History, theendofhistory.net, jbshreve.com, where we help believers understand the world, the chaotic world around them, with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that made those times. Thanks for listening, everyone.